Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. Our guest tonight is one of the most distinguished and creative contemporary architects, Edward Larrabee Barnes. He combines the sensitive eye of an artist with the practicality of an engineer. The result, designs that bring sensitivity, new dignity, and intelligence to our cities. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Barnes. Today, there is no longer a sense of a single style in architecture. There is no one proper way to design a building. In an age where pluralism seems to prevail both in art and architecture, what would you say defines quality in architecture?
Well, I think essentially that the architecture is solving problems for people, and that isn't in a narrow sense. That's in a broad sense, in sense of providing some sort of spiritual surrounding, some expression of what's going on in the building. And I think the question of style, what style you do that with, is somewhat irrelevant. To me, the appropriateness of a building for its site, for its place, for its use, is what really lasts. Not a fashionable style of the moment, not a veneer. And so I know that this sounds like an old functionalist, but I think that taking functions in the broadest sense, if you're doing a church, obviously the functions are far more in depth than just how you get in and how you get out and all this. And I think that's true of every building. If you take the broadest view, I am a functionalist, and I think that's what lasts in a building.
The world of art concerns you almost as much as the world of architecture, and it has manifested itself in such diverse places as your designs for the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Scaife Gallery, which is an addition to the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, the Marlborough Gallery in New York, the Wichita Art Museum in Kansas, the Fine Arts and Indian Museum in Santa Fe, the Fort Lauderdale Museum of the Arts in Florida, the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts in Texas. There will be a gallery in the new IBM building, and the model behind you is the new building for the Asia Society that contains the for Asia House that contains the Asia Society galleries as well. I can't think of anyone who has designed more spaces and places to exhibit works of art. How did that all begin?
Oh, well, it all began with the job at Walker, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, which was just a marvelous, marvelous job. Well, Minneapolis has two museums. One of them is very establishment, and the trustees there tend to be over 60, maybe over 50. The trustees of Walker were all of them in their late 30s and early 40s, and the kinds of shows they had there were very experimental shows.
What's the response of artists to that design?
The artists have been very, very nice about it. I think that's one of the nicest things. I remember at the opening, several artists said extremely nice things about it. There's too many museums, if you think about it, like the Guggenheim, which they upstage the art entirely. It is extremely hard to put one show in the Guggenheim that looks different from the last show, and it's very difficult to ever forget the architecture. The problem is then, what is that architecture if it's anonymous? Is that what you're doing, trying to build anonymous space? And I think that the basic elements in architecture, in museum architecture, when you throw away everything and get to the really important things, they're very much there, which have to do with the proportions of a room and the quality of light and the way you move through spaces. Those three things. You can get rid of a lot of the Frank Lloyd Wright detail and the pomp and circumstance of that building, and that's what's dominating. But if you simply have to make a white space, a box of white space, which is the right proportion, and then put paintings in it, that's what the artists like. I have a...
it's not what the architects like, generally.
No, I think that a lot of architects feel that the most important thing in the collection is going to be their building. And if you think about it, if you have to measure other museums that you've been, and think what the architecture does. Let us say you are a painter and you find yourself hanging on a corrugated concrete wall. Well, you don't see a single gallery that's selling pictures using anything but the most simple recessive materials and using light. They may not always use white, but they essentially are working with the quality of reflected light. So that I have been meaning to take photographs in other museums of pictures in fussy surroundings, dominant surroundings, and then I have beginning to collect some sketches by artists. I have a sketch by a man named von Schlegel, who's a very good sculptor. David von Schlegel from New Haven. And he just quite innocently drew some huge piece of sculpture in the kind of space that he thought it should be. And you should see what an artist thinks space should be. Of course, they do want containment. He doesn't want his piece just out in the open. He does want a reference wall here and a sense of weight there and so on. But he doesn't want any detail on the wall or any distracting colors. I had a call from the Gucci, who had a piece. He knew I was doing a museum, and he thinks of his piece in a white space. And as severe a white space that you possibly could have, contained, not in the open. And is extremely interested in working on a museum. I'm doing the one in Dallas now. I'm trying to make a exact relationship between a well-proportioned space and the piece.
So how would you describe your chief consideration in designing museum space?
Well, those three things I think are important. I usually start with flow. I think that's more important than form. I think you can learn a lot from Disneyland about flow and the so-called storyline and the architecture as a sequential experience and all of that. And with all that pop and the plastic down there, they do care about what happens to you. They do manipulate you. You do have a sense of entrance, a sense of being carried along and taken through, and the experience has a time sequence. An architect should think about that when people go into a museum, that it's going to be a time sequence experience. I think that's where I always start, is that what happens to you, and not necessarily always the same, but what is the experience from one space to the other?
Do you think that natural light is the best way to view art, and how do you accomplish that in a formal museum setting?
I like natural light, but I'm not sure that all the dealers, I think you have to look at the dealers very carefully, because they really have to move pictures and sell them. And almost without exception, dealers and galleries, commercial galleries, use incandescent light, which tends to bring the total focus on the art and not on the space. It really makes it very dramatic. It's like highlighting something. But I think there are ways to do that with daylight, and we have tried it. There are some, the old European museum had glass ceilings, so that when you came into a room, the most brilliant thing was the ceiling. And then the wall would be far less bright. The ceiling is the source of light. You see the source of light. What we have been doing is admitting the daylight on the wall in a cove, so that it slashes the wall. So the most brilliant thing is the wall. And that's quite an extraordinary effect. You can wash the wall with daylight without seeing where it's come from, and very much the way you would with incandescent light. And the picture I recall most vividly, that I know is better in daylight, is a Monet Water Lilies in Pittsburgh. And it's a very impressionistic picture, a pointillist sort of a picture with pinks and oranges, and then there are blues and purples in the water. I was there one day when it was a clear day with blowing cumulus clouds outside, And for one moment, the gallery was yellow sun with yellow light, and then it would change to this blue light when the sun went out of the cloud. And what would happen is, as you sat and watched it, that the blue dots would come right at you and when the sun went under a cloud, and then would go away, and the yellow light would come, and all the other end of the spectrum would come at you. And I asked the man, you probably know his name, who did the Monet show at the Metropolitan, what he thought about daylight on Monet and this question of changing. And he said at least that's one thing we can agree on, that for Impressionist painting you couldn't have anything better than changing light.
What do you see, firstly, as the relationship between art and architecture, and secondly, the future of that collaboration?
I think that the sighting of the art is terribly important, the exact piece for the right place. And that's an experience that you don't get it too often. I think we're accustomed to seeing art sort of strewn around, especially with all these new programs. And I think the discerning eye, the thing that we should be looking for, is the right thing in the right place. And sometimes it's very rough. In our museum in Texas, for example, there are people who are back of this museum who feel that all the art ought to be right out in the street where people can see it. And I am trying to get them to build, there are others, myself included, that feel that it should be a garden wall, and that you should have the art just as important, the way you place art with a garden wall, as it is indoors. And a separation between one piece and the next, and a separation from the sculpture and the parked cars and all of that. So the placement is really terribly important. And the ideal thing, I think, is to work before the architect is committed to the proportions of a space or the proportions of a courtyard or something like that, to work with a sculptor together and put the things at once. Still, I think one has to look at the Renaissance and other periods and other history and say, why the hell can't we do it too? I mean, why is it that we can't have a better mating?
How should we be doing it? What is or should be the future of that collaboration?
I think my particular style is very, very simple. That doesn't mean that I don't think it would be extremely interesting to see, as the new generations of architects come along, to see them becoming more decorative in a poetic way. I think that there is a way to simply not build simple volumetric architecture, modern architecture. There is a way to be decorative. Too often, it does look like a fad, and it does look doesn't look very, very deep. But I think that architects will be thinking of that. But the question of collaboration, what we're talking about, is even more important. Actually, in the case of von Schlegel, I'm working on him and the one we were talking about before, on an open space in Indianapolis, where the placement of his three pieces very much relate to the buildings and very much relate to the landscaping and to the terracing around it. And there's a kind of a back and forth in which he is adjusting his things and the space is adjusting, and it's perfectly clear. It is so clear that he understands that the dynamics of paths and movement, but doesn't know quite what to do about it. And I know that somehow the best would be to have the way these pylons stand related exactly to the way people move through, like a Giacometti, and the relationship between figures in these pylons is terribly important, which relates to movement. But and he respects that, but he gets very rigid sometimes, and so. But I have a great respect for his sensitivity, and I think that between the two of us it'll come off. But it's hard work.
You mentioned before that sighting was very important. And it seems to me that and building in context is very important to you. How important is a building's relationship to its environment? Is that an important consideration in determining a design for the building, at least for you?
I think it's terribly important.
Perhaps you would tell us philosophically, when you talk about context, what you mean. Why don't we start with that and then... come into the building?
Well, I think that my education was that architecture was some sort of sculpture that was put in space, in the sort of Corbusier white box is put in space. Somewhere along the line, I went to Persia and saw these mud villages in which the mud of the street would just suddenly slope up and become the mud of the house, and with blowing dust, you'd see women in chadors covered with dust, and the camels, and it seemed to be absolutely continuous from the ground to the people to the buildings to and the quality of the light. I was so struck by that, and of course by Mykonos, which is some of the Greek islands, by the fact that buildings aren't detached, that they go downhill, that they connect with each other, that they're glued to each other. That kind of grafting a building onto the land is I don't think it's new, but I think that it got lost along the way. I think Frank Lloyd Wright never lost it, but there was a generation of international style architects which tended to forget it. And if you continue with that and put yourself and try to attach to the light, the color of red brick of old buildings nearby, or the quality of detail of old buildings, without being eclectic, without borrowing past forms, you can certainly pick up, first of all, on the scale of the adjacent buildings, where the cornice line is, on the most serious thing of all is the slope of the land. I think that really the geology of the area is so important. The most serious starting point is the slope of the rock and where you put the building, and the trees and the things that come later are less important. It's very, very important to see the site in the largest context and not become attached to some minor thing and miss the big picture.
How did you adapt that philosophy to some of your museum construction? For example, you have a museum in New Mexico as well as in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Obviously, varying designs must be involved in those two locations, and how can you design in so many styles?
Well, in the case of Santa Fe, it's very hard to go to Santa Fe and not like the adobe construction, which is no longer economic. The adobe construction requires maintenance by Indian squaws, and for all kinds of reasons that's out. But sometime in the 20s and 30s they started, I think, a kind of glazing, the way you make a cake, and they Pueblicized all sorts of buildings with a kind of a cement, and it looks just like icing. And it's a little bit like sort of Rudolph Valentino era, but very charming. And the city, so you have these serious Indian buildings where you really feel a sense of weight and simplicity of mud bricks piled on them. And then you have these glazed buildings which look a little bit like stage sets, but they're the same color, the same soft corners. And now I'm moving in on this, and I haven't yet decided how to get with it, because clearly the great charm of Santa Fe is that there's no high-rise yet, and there's very little that breaks this somewhat romanticized Pueblo architecture.
We use a classical Indian shape for the design of the building?
The building itself, as I said, starts with on very functional grounds. It will have a Pueblo and Navajo collection, and the Pueblo will be shown in a kiva-like round shape, soft round shape. Pueblo culture was a home-loving, agrarian, introverted, family-oriented, still very secure, much more secure than we are, farming community. And the Navajos are a transient, nomadic. They've always been nomads. They always have been wandering from one place to the other. They will be on the outside of this circle, and there they will ricochet, if you will, around this circle against hard forms, and you will never feel settled. In the Navajo show, you will have a sense of movement, and actually when they have the exile and they're all beaten up on and go down to Mexico, the space will compress and get dark and open up again. So that the Navajo the character of the Navajo space that you go through will be somewhat unsettling, and somewhat you will have to keep moving, and you will continually get odd angles. The character of the, and they are definitely a centripetal, or is that the word, centrifugal, as opposed to the Pueblo society, which is inward looking. So there you have a case. I take that as functional, that the architecture is, when you say functional, you go way beyond door swings and planning bathrooms and things like that. The architecture has to be responsive to the very philosophy of these two cultures.
Let us turn to the character of the space that you have created for New York. Your new design for the IBM building rejects the international style, the glass box design that we see all over Manhattan. How did you arrive at this 5-sided, 603-foot high, green-gray, polished granite tower? Perhaps you should tell us what the central theme of the whole design is. You were kind enough to bring a model. And can we move it a bit forward?
Well, this is a very early model with no detail, and the base isn't right and so on, but it does show you this prismatic form.
Shows it to us in context.
In context with
on
the other buildings around.
57th Street and Madison Avenue.
Yeah.
Now, how did you arrive at the prism shape? And would it be correct to say that in this 5-sided building, from every angle, you really see a different shaped building?
Yes, that's what I hope, that as you rotate round this, sometimes you'll see something which is somewhat in keeping with the older buildings, just the end, and sometimes you'll see a slab, and sometimes you'll see a block, and it will change, as opposed to simple rectangular buildings which don't do that. So it has that, certain forms have that quality of changing in light, especially as you move around them. The problem, it's a problem of change of scale in cities. It's a very, very tough one, and it's interesting to have to take that up right after talking about continuity. As far as I'm concerned, I don't particularly, I wouldn't change scale, but one has to change scale. And if you think of Trinity Church standing at the end of Wall Street, and you think that's clashing, and then you think that Wall Street is to the World Trade Building exactly in the same. And if you look here, you'll see side streets which are brownstones, and you'll see buildings of the 20s and 30s which are at this height, and then you'll see the new leap in scale which is going to take place all around here.
How does the IBM building relate to the gridiron of the city?
On this plan here, that's 57. This is Madison, that's 56. And we decided not to set the building back the way they do on 6th Avenue, but to put it on the sidewalk. This isn't just my idea, this is the new perception of keeping the street life alive, to have putting retail. I think you all know that putting in banks and airline ticket offices and empty plazas are out, and the City Planning Commission and all of the enlightened planners and so on realize that New York has to have active street life, which means restaurants and bookstores and that certain kind of retail. This building then is packed right up against 57th and right up against Madison, with retail here and retail there, active retail, and the central lobby for the elevators. You enter on a diagonal and you go through the building. The park, which would, ever since Seagram's, have been on the street, sort of cauterizing the avenue as you're walking along, I mean, sort of blanking it out as far as continuity of retail, is in back. And there is a pedestrian arcade through the block. This is a glass-covered park with magnolia trees in it, and an open-up arcade through Bonwit to 5th Avenue. So
does that correspond to this glass greenhouse? So
yeah.
It is actually a park that you have put under glass
yeah.
and indoors. How can those magnolia trees, those beautiful, how tall are they?
45 feet, we hope, we think.
How will they survive and flourish in that indoor park?
Well, this is not like the Ford Foundation Park, which is maintained at some expense at ordinary working temperature and humidity. This is the air that's heats this and cools it is the air that you're required by law to throw away. A certain amount of air you have to throw out by law for fresh air makeup. The codes require the architect to pump in fresh air and pump out a certain amount of air just to guarantee that it's fresh. We take the air that's being pumped out and dump it into the greenhouse park. And we are told with very little addition that that will keep it at a halfway climate, and the climate being never below 40 and never over 90 or 92. And that is so that's a halfway climate. It may be forbidding out on the street, very hot or very cold, and this, of course, is like all buildings, is absolutely stabilized. But this is a halfway thing that drifts up and down. We then talked to our friends at the Botanical Garden about, got a weather map of the United States and found on the map what matched that cycling, and it turns out to be Williamsburg and Virginia. And so we believe we can grow magnolias and anything
and
else.
that's how you arrived at magnolias as a selection, what would flourish best in that climate.
Yeah.
That indoor park, in spite of the fact it is a private office building, really is a public plaza and a public space. How do you propose for the public to use that space?
The city allowed IBM to build about 6 extra floors. There is a architect designing an as-of-right building can build a building without even talking to the city planning commission or doing anything. But if you
provide... no architect worth his salt would build an as-of-right building, let alone on a site like that.
And nowadays, these bonuses are pretty attractive to the owners. The bonus, if you do something for the public, like provide a greenhouse park or a plaza or fountains or so many benches or very especially an arcade going through, you're allowed to build more bulk. It also means that IBM has to keep that park open until 12:30 at night and has to police it, maintain it, clean it, scrub it, so it's just like Paley Park. And the public has an amenity, half an acre, maintained not by the taxpayers, maintained by IBM, and IBM has the extra floors. And this is a pattern which is being used in other cities. I think New York is as advanced as any in this way of having intelligent bonuses.
Sometimes I think you think it may be a bit too advanced, that sometimes the bonus that a builder likes, the architect might not totally approve of. How much of a building's design is designed really by zoning laws rather than by architects?
That's a, that's a question I think is terribly interesting. A lot is filling out the zoning envelope, a lot of it. In fact, if you look at New York, you can historically see the zoning envelope change from the setback envelope. You realize those setback buildings are done because there's what's called a sky exposure plane. You're not allowed in that day to build so high that you'd cast a shadow in the street. And at a certain angle, you could build up, and then you built as much as you could at that angle. The angle changed on the avenues to the streets so that you can actually, some buildings you can see it sloping differently on the avenues and on the streets and on the corner and so on. If you had the zoning laws, you could look up there and see exactly who designed it. The same is true of our building. We're allowed to cover 40% of the lot, and this building covers 39.99 or something like that. And we're allowed a certain bulk if we provide these bonuses, and this building provides that bulk and those floors. We can change the shape. You can squeeze it this way and make it higher, or you can manipulate with it. But
how much flexibility do you have in that design? How much flexibility do you have within that?
Well, you don't have too much when you think about it. You can't cover any more ground. I could make a different shape. I could have that much floor space, a rectangle or a square.
Did you consider a shape other than the prism?
Oh yes, lots of space. But this one did what I was telling you I wanted to do, was to strengthen the retail on those two streets and to create a mid-block park facing south. But I think that one tends to think that because it's a big building that you're designing a cathedral with all of the freedom and artistic freedom but you really are working with a kind of a warehouse for people. And I liken it more to the dock buildings in Amsterdam and that kind of thing. Or the loft buildings in Lowell, Massachusetts. It's a very simple building form, repetitive bays, and it's a working form. And in the hierarchy of city structures, perhaps it's too bad we don't have churches. I believe that if you said certain buildings should be conspicuous, that they should be the spiritual ones. And I had mixed emotions about the validity of all office buildings attempting to competitively outdo the other, as opposed to a very handsome zoning law which forms the city. I think a great deal of what's great about New York is the zoning controls, as opposed to Dallas and Houston, which is absolutely out of control.
Do they look very much different than New York?
Oh, it's just missing teeth all over, and any building is doing anything, and so on. The thing that I feel about New York are these marvelous streets, the volume of the street.
Well, very much in the European.
Yeah, the shape of the streets.
Well, if you tell us that zoning law is influential in shaping the city, does our zoning law make sense as it is written now?
Well,
you tell us this is going to be happening all over town.
Yeah, this has been, we had a recession, and this is one of the first buildings after the recession. There are going to be more, and this zoning law, which is producing this kind of bonus and this kind of bulk, is going to be tested. If everybody uses it, I think the city is going to be overbuilt. There is a simple formula which you can observe, that you should have high buildings on the avenues, which are wide streets, and low buildings on the streets, the side streets. Now that simple formula doesn't apply. There have been too many exceptions made. But imagine if that did apply. If just by zoning you could say all of the buildings on the avenues going north and south can be high, and the streets, which are narrow and slow and more pedestrian, dip down to the old scale, that the city as a whole would have a kind of a pattern, a kind of form. I think the problem with zoning is now this is new, and a great many exceptions are being made. There were exceptions made to get building going after the recession, and A. Louise Huxtable and other people are commenting on it, and I think the Planning Commission has got to take a good hard look to see if the zoning laws shouldn't be tightened.
How would you zone the city?
Well, I suppose an architect would not have the same problems if you could just push a button. I would like to try what I just said, to define the avenues and make the streets small, and stop mid-block building and keep the building on the avenues. The trouble with going backwards is that the fellow who owns land on the street right now perhaps has a right to build a big building, and when you say this architect wants to make all the streets low, you're depriving him of rent up in the sky and the value of his property. You're probably depriving the city of taxes because they're taxed the potential of the property. So it's very difficult to ever go backwards in zoning. It's very difficult to get back what you've given away, and that's, I think, is extremely difficult, because you're taking value away when you make an exception that somebody can build more than 40% of a lot, and that has been made, the next person's going to come along and say, I want it too. And that's what frightens me about the current situation.
Some buttons were pushed, particularly in the design stages of the IBM building, as well it should have been. You all make the claim that this will be the most energy efficient of modern office buildings. And as most claims are, this one is based, as contrasted to most claims, this one is based on some very profound research. Perhaps you might tell us the process that a company like IBM, together with an architect such as yourself, using your skills and their computer technology, arrived at some conclusions that helped shape the design of this building. And what does it mean actually for the future of other buildings? Everybody doesn't have IBM as a client, but is there something that can be applied here to other buildings as well?
Yeah, I think insulation is changed completely. Everybody knows that. That's completely changed. Aesthetically, it means that thermopane, that is double glass, is in, and aesthetically that means that the panes can only be so big. Just back a little way, when you could use plate glass, you could have startlingly big sheets of glass. So the buildings could be quite extraordinary, that the size of the sheets of glass you could use. Now when we're going universally to small windows, either small punched windows or ribbon windows or something, rather than a Seagram's type facade, and double glazing, it makes a totally different texture that you have to deal with. That the insulation is something I think everybody can come to grips with. The controls are the thing that IBM was very good at. The business of simply turning off the lights, of transferring heat from an overheated space to an underheated space, rather than throwing it out and heating the other space. Simply getting all you can out of the heating plant, not just overheating spaces and throwing the heat out, or in some cases, in the old days, people would cool the air, deliver it somewhere, and then heat it up in the room. First cool it and then heat it again. Ridiculous procedures. And all of these have been pretty much in the industry dropped. IBM, when it comes to controls, is probably way in the front.
Did you use computer models in the design stage?
Yes, yes. All the engineers now are designed by computer.
How does that work?
I'm not sure I know. I know that in the case of structural engineering, they can...
Do you analyze the combination of design features in some way to see how they work in that site?
I don't see how you use it for anything inexact or intuitive like design. It means this availability of the computer in structural engineering means things are so precise that we're designing absolutely close to the safety factor, so that all of these buildings are becoming limber. They were over-designed in the old days. It was so difficult steel was over-designed. They threw in extra steel. And nowadays, what you can do with a computer is to hone that thing down so there isn't the poundage of steel has gone way down, the bracing has gone way down to just the code limits, and that is extremely interesting, because all of these big buildings, whether it's John Hancock or this one or Citicorp, or all of them, are limber, moving buildings, and it's quite a different concept.
You mentioned ribbon windows. Is that one of the innovative design features? How does that work?
Well, the ribbon windows are simply to cut out the amount of glass, but perhaps you're referring to the ventilating of the slot. Yes, in this building, we felt that we should be able to get fresh air. And so we have, that is, probably saves energy in spring and fall. That is, you often notice that yourself, that's the time when you want to open a window. In the wintertime, the heat runs all the time. In the summertime, the air conditioning runs all the time. But spring and fall, when the temperature is going up and down, rather than sending the mechanical plant crazy, keeping up with it, you simply open a window in the old-fashioned way. This building will have slots under all the windows with a little hopper on the sill, so that you can open it. The slot is the length of the room and 4 inches, which is equivalent to a window or something like this, if you put it all together. And you lift a little damper on the sill, and the air comes in, the rain can't come in, the bugs can't come in. I don't know whether... It remains to be seen whether it's misused. Of all the things we're doing in here, this is the most controversial. The fear is that people will use it and leave it open and the heat will go out. But on the other hand,
well, since so many other things open and close automatically, why can't that? If the lights go off automatically in a room where no one is after a certain point in time, why can't that be controlled?
That's what our mechanical engineers recommended, that these should operate mechanically. First of all, it was expensive, and secondly, I think where it settled down was that they will be locked in summer, locked in winter, and available for use in the half seasons. And if they're misused, they'll have to lock them all year long, or put in the controls in the future. And we have the conduits for the controls.
But I don't think I like that idea of discipline.
You see, this you can't put this through a computer. This is. Now you're trying to say how it's going to be used. Human behavior, you can't tell what's going to happen. I can see it being very much misused and all the heat running right out the air.
You mentioned the fact that this was the first building under construction after a period of recession. Since that time, quite happily we hope for the city, there are a number of very important buildings that are under construction. One of them will be your, so to speak, next-door neighbor. AT&T
Right.
will be constructed exactly across the street from where IBM. I assume that presents certain opportunities and certain problems. Is there any coordination on the ground plane and any other part of the street? Because it seems to me that it's a unique opportunity on one of the most significant streets, in surely the most significant city in the world at this point in time, to go beyond making architectural statements. What kind of coordination exists?
Well, I'm in a funny position because we started first, and we spent a great deal of time working with Bonwitz, and at this site, which is
That
now
is a funny position.
AT&T site was to be a hotel, and I spent a great deal of time working with the hotel people and their architects. In fact, we thought of having a block party almost to get all together. And I had a feeling that I was grafting my building into an ongoing situation. The hotel was a little bit ahead of us. And this is New York for you. It now turns out we're the oldest one. Bonwitz is being torn down, and they're coming to see us, and AT&T has followed across the street, so we're the oldest one.
Are they coming to see you too?
Well, I have some reservation about AT&T. They got a variance to go over the 40%. I suspect it was that the city gave it to them simply under the threat that they would go to New Jersey if they didn't get it. They had a certain amount of leverage at that period. So they're building close to 60% of lot coverage. Furthermore, their building is building very high ceilings. The average ceiling height is a couple of feet higher than our average ceiling height throughout the building. And the result is that with roughly 2/3 of our square footage, they are building a building which is higher than ours and has roughly the same bulk on a much smaller lot. So that while I don't, I think the funny top is fine, and I like architects to have fun. I'm all for it. But this thing that has been overlooked about that building is the bulk. And the reason that I feel particularly concerned is that the shadow will fall on the greenhouse. And so we have to match that by putting lights in the greenhouse to light the trees. We will get sun, but not as much, and we do have to depend now at odd moments and supplementing.
Does one consult on some of these design problems? Is it difficult to coexist?
I think in that case, the question of bulk and size to a company is so serious. It is the question of how big the floors are. It's money. It's a very big deal. That I think they simply had their hands full working with the city, and the idea of talking to the architect across the street would be the last thing you do.
What would you
Once
recommend for the
settled,
future if that ever occurs again? That kind of, major construction side by side. What an opportunity for us.
I think the local community boards should be active in that. New York has a very difficult for the architect, cumbersome system of community board review, and it's tough, but I think it produces dividends. I think the place that should have been caught was the community board.
It's also a community board where there's not really a nighttime constituency by and large, because it's such a commercial area.
Well, don't know, it's amazing. There are people here that are who do live here, but I don't know what other vehicle. I think the Planning Commission must have the right to make variances and things, but the check we have here is the community board, and they can raise hell if they want to. It's rather difficult for an architect on one side of the street to throw bricks at an architect on the other side of the street. Much easier if the community board would step in and do it. And there are architects, young architects, who find community board work interesting, and it is interesting, very interesting. And that in the end, the reason that Grand Central was saved and all kinds of wonderful things that happened in New York is community action. And there's nothing stronger than that, and I think that's where it should be.
But we haven't talked about the future direction of modern architecture. Where is it going?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think the the current show at the Museum of Modern Art presents a kind of a panoramic confusion of styles and approaches, and I think that can be presented as richness, as diversity, richness, pluralism, eclecticism, all of that. It also can be presented as uncertainty, confusion, and lack of conviction. And I think you'd find the architectural students caught between those two visions. I think that on the one hand, you find architectural students terribly interested in pluralism and all of this. On the other hand, you have a feeling that they would like very much to have something which had real deep meaning. And I can't give you a much better answer to that. Where it's going to go from here, I don't know. Whether it's going to discipline and a rationale and a sort of a common thrust is going to return, or whether it's going to continue to spread.
Thank you very much for making a great deal happen here this evening. Thank you, Ed Barnes.